Orchestrated fresh memoir narrative with new characters, American details, and strategic emotional beats. Orchestrated fresh memoir narrative with new characters, American details, and strategic emotional beats. The group text came in at 5:52 on a Tuesday morning, while I was standing at my kitchen counter in the dark, eating cold leftover rice straight out of the container because I had a 7 o'clock call with opposing counsel and no time for anything that required a stove. My phone lit up the whole counter. It was from my mother, sent to a thread that included my younger sister and two of my aunts, but I noticed immediately, not me on the two line. I'd been added almost as an afterthought, my number tacked on at the end like a typo someone forgot to delete. The message was about Thanksgiving. She wrote that after a lot of thought, the family had decided to keep things small and meaningful this year. Just the people who'd really shown up for one another. The people who put the family first. She wrote that she hoped I understood, that it wasn't personal, and that we'd all catch up after the holidays when things settled down. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down, finished the rice, rinsed the container, and put it in the drying rack. Really shown up. That was the part that landed, the way a splinter lands. Small, deep, and impossible to ignore once you felt it. Because I knew the translation, my sister had been talking again. My sister, who at 34 had never kept a job past the 1-year mark, who treated every apartment lease like a suggestion, who called me maybe twice a year and only ever when the ground was disappearing under her feet. I had shown up every single one of those times, but I'd missed our cousin's baby shower in March because I was in a windowless conference room in Houston for a deposition, and I'd missed my mother's birthday dinner in June because I had a filing deadline that, if I'd blown it, would have cost a small business owner his entire case. So in the family ledger, the real one, the unwritten one they all carried around in their heads, I was the one who didn't show up. I didn't text back. I didn't call. I sat down at my little kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I opened an app on my phone I'd been opening almost every night for the past 2 months. A real estate listing. An 880 stone farmhouse on 4 acres in the Catskills, with a creek along the back property line and a stand of old apple trees somebody had planted more than a century ago and somebody else had spent his whole life pruning. The price had dropped 3 times. The listing had been up since spring. I'd been telling myself I was just looking. At 7, I took my call. At 8, between calls, I phoned my attorney, who was also the person I trusted most in the world for the last 9 years, and told her I was done waiting. I told her to put in an offer at the second price drop, all cash, quick close, no contingencies. I didn't absolutely need. By the time I broke for lunch, the offer was submitted. By the time I shut my laptop that night, it had been accepted. My name is Margot. I'm 29. I'm a forensic accountant, which means that when a company suspects someone has been stealing from it, or when a divorce gets ugly enough that one spouse is sure the other is hiding money, or when an estate doesn't add up, I'm the person they bring in to reconstruct what actually happened from the paper trail. People lie. Numbers, given enough patience, usually don't. My whole job is sitting with the discrepancy between what someone says happened and what the records show, and refusing to look away until the two of them match. I don't get angry at the discrepancy. I document it. That's a useful habit. It turned out to be more useful than I ever expected. I want to tell you about the money, because that's what this is really about, and I need you to understand the full shape of it before I tell you what they did. I keep a file. I started it during my second year out of school, the year I first earned enough that the request stopped being for $40 here and $100 there, and started coming in real amounts. I didn't start it out of resentment. I started it because tracking money is what I do, and because some quiet part of me already suspected that one day I'd need to know the total. I called the file Household because that felt neutral, and I've never shown it to a single person except my attorney. The first entry is from when I was 20. My mother called me at school crying, saying she was 3 weeks behind on the mortgage and the bank was sending letters. I had $1,100 to my name, money from a summer internship and a tax refund. I sent her $800. She told me I'd saved her. A month and a half later, my sister posted photos from a long weekend in Nashville. The entries grow as I did. There was the $4,000 for what my mother called a roof emergency after a storm that I later learned had gone toward my sister's portion of a girls' trip to Cabo. There was the 9,000 I co-signed and then ended up covering on a car loan for my sister because of course she stopped making the payments because of course the dealership came to me because my credit was the only credit in the family that had ever been treated like something worth protecting. There was the 6,000 for a dental emergency that turned out to be elective cosmetic work, which I only found out about because my sister couldn't stop showing everyone her new smile at Christmas. And then there was the big one. 3 years ago, my sister got herself tangled up with a man she'd been living with. A lease in both their names, a shared account he cleaned out before he disappeared, a credit card she'd let him be an authorized user on, and a stack of overdue everything. My mother called me on a Sunday night and told me my sister was about to be evicted and might end up with a judgment that would chase her for a decade. She told me she didn't know who else to call. She asked me, specifically, not to let my sister know the money came from me, because my sister would be too ashamed. She told me she'd pay me back as soon as she could. I wired $52,000. I sold part of my brokerage account to do it, and I ate the taxes, and I told myself this was the bottom, this was the floor. After this, things would change. My sister never knew. My mother never paid back a cent. And 8 months later, my sister announced at the 4th of July barbecue that she was treating my parents to a week in Sedona. Her gift, paid for, she said, with money she'd been carefully putting aside. My mother teared up. My father squeezed my sister's shoulder. I stood at the grill turning burgers nobody had asked me to turn, and I said congratulations, and I meant nothing by it at all. The total in my file, the night the Thanksgiving text came in, was $116,400, spread across 9 years. Gone. Not loaned. I'd stopped using that word with myself a long time ago. Gone. I'm not telling you this so you'll be angry on my behalf. Though maybe you will be, and I won't stop you. I'm telling you so you understand that buying that farmhouse wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't me running away. It was the same thing I do at work when I finally see the pattern clearly enough to name it. I followed the money, and the money told me the truth. For 9 years, my savings had been quietly bleeding out in one direction, and I knew, the way you know the sun is going to come up, that it was never going to stop on its own. You can't reason a leak into sealing itself. You have to change the pipe. A piece of real property in my name only, 4 hours from anyone in my family, recorded and titled and locked, was the new pipe. One thing I want to be honest about, because I've read the way people talk about women like me, and I know the word that gets used. Doormat. I want you to know I wasn't only ever silent. 2 years ago, after the dental thing, I actually said it. I sat my mother down and I told her, in plain words, that the next time someone needed rescuing, the answer was going to be no, and that I meant it, and that I needed her to hear me. She cried. She said she understood. She said she understood. She said she'd never put me in that position again. And then, 6 months later, the call came anyway, dressed up in a new emergency, and I caved because she's my mother, and because hope is the most expensive thing I own. I'm not telling you I was helpless. I'm telling you that knowing better and doing better are two different muscles, and mine took a long time to build. The closing happened fast. I signed remotely on a Friday. The farmhouse had belonged to a man named Otis, who'd bought it in his 30s and spent the next 40 years putting it back together with his hands. He died the winter before with no kids, just a great nephew somewhere in Arizona who wanted nothing but the check. When my attorney walked me through it on a video call, I could see Otis everywhere. In the way the stone around the hearth had been laid by someone who cared about how the pieces met. In the hand-built shelves tucked into the thick window wells. In the orchard out back that someone had kept alive long past the point where it made any economic sense. He'd loved that place. That mattered to me more than the square footage. The Saturday after closing, I packed my car and drove north, up the thruway and then off it, onto roads that got narrower and quieter until the GPS gave up and I was navigating by the printed directions Otis's old neighbor had emailed me. When I came around the last bend and saw the house standing there in the low November light, gray stone against gray sky, the bare apple trees behind it like something out of a book, I felt something let go in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. I sat in the car in the gravel for a long time before I went in. Here's the part where I tell you what I did with the next 6 weeks, because it's the part that mattered. I rekeyed every lock in the house. Not just the front and back doors, the whole set, New hardware, key to a pattern that matched nothing I'd ever handed anyone. I had a security system installed. The real kind, cameras at the gate and both doors in the back corner by the shed. All of it feeding to an app on my phone and storing 30 days of footage on a server I controlled. I had motion-triggered floodlights mounted along the whole front of the house. I drove into town and introduced myself at the hardware store and the diner and the little market, and I let people get used to my face. I had coffee with the Pruitts, the older couple a quarter-mile down the road, who'd known Otis for 30 years and were so quietly glad that someone who gave a damn had moved in that Joan Pruitt actually got a little teary. And I went to the county sheriff's substation and I introduced myself to a deputy named Shauna Lott, who'd grown up 2 towns over, and I told her the truth, that I was a single woman living alone on a rural property, and that I had some family I'd recently put distance between myself and that I wanted to know how things worked out here if I ever needed help. She was kind and she was specific. She told me exactly how dispatch handled the area, how long response times ran, what to do and what not to do. I wrote it all down, the way I write everything down. I want to be clear about one thing, because I know it's the question people ask. How would they ever find me if I never told them where I'd gone? I'm a forensic accountant. I find people for a living. A recorded deed is a public document. Anyone with 20 minutes and the county clerk's website can pull up who owns what. I knew that the day I signed, which is exactly why I didn't bother trying to hide the purchase so much as I bothered making the property a fortress. I wasn't planning to stay secret. I was planning to be ready. I also relocated my whole working life. In case you're wondering how a person just moves 4 hours from everything, my firm had gone mostly remote 2 years earlier, and I'd already been angling toward independent consulting. The move just made me pull the trigger. I gave notice, kept my 3 biggest clients, set up a home office in what used to be Otis's reading room, and discovered I could do nearly all of it from a desk overlooking the orchard. The drive to a courthouse a few times a year was nothing. I'd been commuting through worse my whole career. I didn't post about the house. I didn't tell my family I'd moved. As far as they knew, I was still in my apartment in the city. And the silence held, no calls, no texts, nothing, for almost 7 weeks. Which told me everything. They reached out when they needed something. The absence of need was the absence of contact. I'd known that for years. It was just easier to see it from 4 hours away. What finally broke the silence wasn't an apology. It was a voicemail from my mother on a Thursday evening in early December, while I was sitting by the fire with a book and a glass of wine and the wind coming down off the ridge. Her voice had that particular sound it got when she was scared and trying very hard to seem calm, the smooth customer service tone she used on anyone she needed to manage. She said my sister had heard I bought some kind of property. She said she really thought we should talk. She said it was important that I understand the situation, that there were things I might not have considered, financially, that the family wanted to help me think through. I didn't call back. I texted my attorney, her name is Naomi, and she'd been expecting this and told her the clock had just sped up. She wrote back, "Good. Let them." It was a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks later, just past 3. I was at the stove making chili because it had snowed the night before, and the house was the kind of cold that wants a long simmering pot of something. The gate camera pinged on my phone. I turned the burner down, wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked it up. 3 people were coming up the drive on foot, having parked outside the gate. My mother was in front, in the good coat she wore when she was about to ask for something, walking with the particular posture she adopted when she'd already decided how the conversation was going to go. My sister was a step behind her, looking up at the house and around at the orchard and the shed with an expression I recognized instantly. The one she got when she was doing math in her head about what something was worth. And a third person I didn't know at first. A man in a quilted barn jacket, carrying a clipboard and a tablet and one of those laser measuring tools. Walking a little apart from them like a contractor who'd been hired and wasn't sure he wanted the job. It took me a second, then I understood. They brought an appraiser. They'd hired someone to put a number on my house. I'd seen plenty of appraisals in my line of work. I knew the forms. I knew the tools. I stood in my warm kitchen, watching 3 people on a 3-inch screen come to assess a home that none of them had ever set foot in, that none of them had contributed a dollar toward, that exactly one person on earth had any legal right to be inside. My mother knocked. twice, politely, which honestly surprised me. I'd expected her to try the handle first. When I didn't answer, she knocked again, harder, and called my name in a bright tone, the way you'd call a kid who was hiding. Then she turned and said something to the man with the clipboard, and he nodded and made a note, and I watched my mother gesture at the front of the house, the way a person gestures at a thing they're describing to someone who's going to write down its value. My sister tried the door. It didn't move. She tried it again, leaning her weight into it, and then stepped back and looked at her phone and held the screen up toward my mother. They had a short exchange. Then my mother reached into her purse and took out a key. I knew that key. Years ago, when I'd lived in my first real apartment, I'd given my mother a spare in case of emergencies, and I'd never gotten it back. And I'd long since moved twice and never thought about it again. She didn't know that, though. She slid that old apartment key into my new front door like it might work, like the universe owed her entry, and she turned it, and of course nothing happened. She pulled it out, frowned at it, tried it again. When the lock still didn't give, she said something sharp to my sister, and I could read the frustration even on a tiny screen with no sound. What happened next I watched in real time, switching from camera to camera with my thumb, my chili forgotten on the stove. My sister walked around the side of the house. I tapped over to the side camera. She was checking windows methodically, one after another, pressing up on the sashes. All locked. She went around to the back, past the woodpile, and tried the shed Otis had built, and that was locked too. She came back around shaking her head, and my mother got on the phone and started pacing the front walk, talking fast. And I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I'd watched 100 people on 100 surveillance clips describe a situation to someone who could give them options. After a few minutes, she hung up, said something to my sister, and the two of them looked toward the back of the house. I switched cameras again. My sister had found the one weak point I knew about and hadn't gotten around to upgrading yet. A small bathroom window at the back, original frame, older latch. She was working at it with something thin, a card or a putty knife, trying to pop it. The man in the barn jacket stayed up near the front, not helping, not leaving, just standing there with his clipboard, and I remember thinking very clearly and very calmly that his presence was the single most important detail for what came next, and that Naomi was going to be glad he'd stayed. I let my sister work at the window for about a minute and a half. I wanted it documented. I wanted it unambiguous. Then I pressed the trigger on my phone. It wasn't a siren. The system was set up to do two things silently and one thing loudly. Silently, it alerted the county dispatch line that Deputy Lott and I had already walked through together, and it sent a one-tap text to Naomi, who'd driven up that morning and was waiting at the diner in town for exactly this. Loudly, it lit the whole front of the house. 8 floodlights came on at once, white in total, even in the gray December afternoon. My mother shrieked. I heard it faintly, even through the kitchen window. My sister jerked back from the bathroom window and dropped whatever she'd been using in the snow. The appraiser fumbled his clipboard, and from down the road I heard, then saw on the gate camera the cruiser turning in, its lights going, rolling up to the gate I'd unlocked remotely the second I hit the trigger. Behind it came Naomi's car. I turned off the stove. I put on my coat. I walked out my own front door. My mother recovered first. She always did. She moved toward Deputy Lott with her hands open and visible and her voice already smoothing itself into its most reasonable register, the one she used on anyone she needed to win over. There'd been a misunderstanding, she said. She'd been worried sick about her daughter, meaning me, out here alone, and she'd had reason to believe I might be in some kind of distress, and she'd only come to make sure I was all right. She waved a hand at the appraiser as if he were a piece of furniture that had wandered in on its own. Deputy Lott looked at the clipboard the man had picked back up out of the snow. She looked at my mother. She said, very evenly, that she needed everyone to step back down to the driveway, please. My sister tried a different door. She turned to me directly, and her face shifted into the soft, slightly wounded expression she'd been deploying on me since we were children, the one that used to work every time. She didn't understand why I was being like this, she said. She'd been worried too. The property was a huge financial risk and she didn't think I thought it through. And the family just wanted to help me make a smart decision before I got in over my head. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about Sedona. I thought about $52,000 and a smile that wasn't a dental emergency. I thought about a key from an apartment I'd left behind years ago. I didn't say any of it. Naomi opened her folder. New York is specific about trespass, and it's specific about attempted unlawful entry, and Naomi had spent 2 weeks preparing for the possibility that we'd need every word of it. She laid it out plainly with the relevant sections cited and handed a copy to Deputy Lott and kept one for herself. She had a title search. She had the recorded deed with one name on it, mine. She had a notarized statement from my former landlord confirming I'd given notice and vacated the apartment. The one whose key my mother had just tried in my front door months earlier. She had a clean timeline establishing that no one present, ever, at any point, had been given any ownership interest in this property or any permission to enter it. The appraiser, she noted for the deputy's benefit, occupied a position the state took a particular interest in, a licensed professional hired to assess a property without the owner's knowledge or consent, which was a thing his licensing board would want to hear about. The man in the barn jacket asked, quietly, if he could go. Deputy Lott told him to wait. What followed wasn't dramatic, not the way it is on television. Nobody wept and confessed. There was no screaming match in the snow. There was a lot of paperwork and Deputy Lott on her radio and Naomi's steady, unhurried voice explaining each document, and the cold coming up off the creek, and the floodlights still throwing everything into hard white relief. My sister was cited for attempted unlawful entry. The appraiser was released with a warning and the information that his board would be receiving a complaint about the circumstances of his hire. My mother was cited for criminal trespass and, it turned out, for filing a false report because she called the non-emergency line earlier that afternoon to manufacture a wellness check as cover, a fact that came out on the deputy's own dispatch log. Naomi served 2 civil trespass notices on the spot, one to my mother and one to my sister before any of them left the property. My mother stood in the gravel with the wind off the ridge cutting through her good coat, and she told me this wasn't over. She told me I was throwing my whole family away over a pile of stones. She told me I'd regret cutting myself off, that I'd be alone out here, that one day I'd understand what I'd done. I told her I hadn't cut anyone off. I told her she'd been the one to decide I hadn't shown up enough to be invited, and that all I'd done was find a place where I was allowed to be. Deputy Lott asked them to leave. They left. I know what you want to know, because I've been on the other side of these stories and I know how it feels when the thread just dangles. So here's what happened to my sister. The attempted unlawful entry at the level she was charged ended in an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal. 6 months of staying out of trouble, and then it comes off her record like it never happened. She also received, through Naomi's civil filing, formal written notice that any future attempt to enter, assess, encumber, or claim any interest in my property would result in a civil suit she had no way to afford. Her lawyer, a man she found through one of my aunts who I don't think had handled a property matter in his life, sent exactly one letter, which Naomi described generously as sincere. We didn't answer it. The appraiser's licensing board did open a review. I never found out how it ended. It wasn't mine to track. My mother sent 3 emails over the following 2 weeks. The first was furious. The second was wounded. The third was careful and almost warm, which told me she'd finally talked to a real lawyer. Naomi read all 3 and told me to answer none of them, and I didn't. What I did instead was finish making the house mine. I cleaned and rehung the brass fixtures Otis had left, the way they were meant to go. I put my own books on his hand-built shelves. I had a wood stove insert put into the big stone fireplace, and a man named Cyrus came out from town and set it in over an afternoon and told me stories about Otis the whole time. How Otis used to bring cider to the volunteer fire department every fall. How he taught half the kids in the valley to fish in that creek. And I was so glad to know them that I almost cried in front of a stranger holding a wrench. Naomi came up for a long weekend in January. We cooked far too much food and ate it at the kitchen table with the orchard white and silent outside the window. And she told me about a case she was untangling, and I told her about a client of mine who'd absolutely been cooking his own books. And we stayed up too late both nights talking about everything except my family. I think about the numbers sometimes. $116,400? I'm never getting it back. And I've made my peace with that. Not the way you make peace by forgetting, But the way you make peace by forgetting, but the way you make peace by finally letting a thing be exactly what it is. A record. A figure. An honest accounting of what those years cost me and what it was worth. In the end, to make them stop. What I won't do is pretend the cost was nothing. I won't perform a forgiveness. I don't feel just so everyone else can be comfortable. I spent my whole life being told that holding a family together takes someone willing to absorb the damage and stay quiet about it. I was that someone for almost a decade. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The damage doesn't stop. It just keeps looking for somewhere soft to land. I'm not soft anymore. I'm something I like a great deal better. I'm a woman standing on 4 acres of frozen orchard with a locked gate and a deed that is only my name on it. Watching the snow come down over a creek, an old man loved enough to keep alive, and for the first time in as long as I can remember, the math finally balances. For 9 years, I told myself that love meant absorbing whatever came at me without complaint, and the bill for that belief came to $116,000. I want to be honest about how I got there, because I don't think I was weak. I think I was decent in a way that nobody taught me how to protect. When my mother called crying, I answered. When my sister was drowning, I threw the rope. Doing right by the people you love is not a flaw. But I learned too late and too expensively that a good heart with no boundaries isn't kindness anymore. It's just fuel for someone else's fire, and the fire never, ever burns itself out on its own. What changed wasn't that I stopped caring. It's that I finally started paying attention. I'm a forensic accountant. I'd spent my whole career refusing to look away from numbers that didn't add up, and yet for years I'd let my own ledger lie to me because the truth was painful. The day I opened that file and actually read it, beginning to end, was the day I let myself be as clear-eyed about my family as I was about every stranger's books I'd ever audited. That clarity didn't make me cold. It made me free. Understanding a pattern is the only thing that lets you finally step out of it. But seeing the truth wasn't enough by itself, and I want to say that plainly, because clarity without follow-through is just a smarter way to keep suffering. Knowing my family would come for the farmhouse and doing nothing would have left me exactly where I started. So I changed the locks. I called Naomi. I had coffee with Sean a lot before I ever needed her. I documented, I prepared, I built the fortress while the sky was still clear, and when my mother slid an old key into my new door, I wasn't lucky. I was ready. The strength I'm proudest of wasn't the floodlights coming on. It was the long, unglamorous patience of getting ready for a fight. I prayed wouldn't come and refused to lose if it did. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Be good to the people you love, but never confuse being good with being available for harm. Look squarely at the things that hurt to look at, because the truth you avoid is the truth that keeps costing you. And once you see clearly, act, even when acting means disappointing people who only ever like the version of you that said yes. Otis spent 40 years rebuilding a house stone by stone because he understood that some things are worth doing slowly and doing right. I think about him every morning now in the home he loved. And I understand that I didn't lose a family out here on this bluff. I finally became someone strong enough to keep one.